Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for making it out here on a Monday night. We're glad that the snow decided to leave us so you could all be here. I'm Tom Stevenson. This is my wife, Jeannie. We currently run the Living in Love and the Living in Love Every Day program here at OLGC, along with, I know they're out there somewhere, our cohorts, Steve and Jasmine Walker, who run the engagement side called Preparing to Live in Love. We've been involved with the program for about 4 years now, and it's just been absolutely life-changing for us. So it's with great joy and enthusiasm that we want to introduce to you Ron and Kathy Fayer. So Ron and Kathy have been joyfully married for 45 years. They're the parents of 10 children and 9 grandchildren. They are the directors of the Pastoral and Matrimonial Renewal Center. They are the authors of the Living in Love series of programs, the Beginning to Live in Love, Preparing to Live in Love, Living in Love Every Day, that spans high school teens up through married adults, through as many years as you want to come, 80. They have worked for over 40 years in evangelization, the catechesis and parish renewal. They have been joyfully strengthening marriages around the world, including Australia, for the past 30 years, and the fruits are so evident with how our lives have been touched through this program, and the 156 or so couples that have gone through the program already here at OLGC in the past 4 years. So we just spent a weekend with them, bringing 20 of those couples through the program. And so if you see those 20 couples floating in their seats, you can pull them back down. Hang on to them so they don't go into the rafters. It's just an incredible experience. So the Walkers and Jeannie and myself had the privilege of working this retreat with the Fayers themselves, and it was just pure, incredible joy. So we are very happy. They're here to share with us their top 10 tips for living in love. So please welcome Ron and Kathy Fayer.
You know, everyone is always impressed about the 10 children. But honestly, the joyfully married part is the real wonder in today's culture. Our children have actually told us that they never once worried that we would get a divorce. It never even entered their minds. That's a wonder. Of course, they did tell us that they worried that we would show up pregnant at one of their weddings. You got to worry about something. So we stand before you as proof positive that John Paul II's prophetic and profound statement in Familiaris Consortium, that couples are a permanent reminder to the church of what happened on the cross, does not mean that marriage is supposed to be some kind of torture.
Seriously, we can honestly say that we are more in love today than we were even on our wedding day 45 years ago. We are more intimate, we're more passionate, we're definitely more playful, and filled with an exceptional kind of joy that we have experienced and we believe is God's plan for us, what God wants for us, but we believe that it's also what He wants for every couple. We hope that's why we hope that that's what you want for yourselves. And that's why you've come tonight. So we feel blessed to be among you. We feel eager to share at least some of what has helped us to stay in love while navigating all of the stresses, the joys, and the sorrows of everyday life.
So here's where the idea for tonight came from. A little while back, I was being interviewed by a journalist over the phone. And she knew we had authored all, this material, this 8-week course and this 7-week course and this workshop. But rather than plow through it all, she said to me, can't you just give me the cliff notes? Like boil it down to the top 10 tips. And so off the top of my head, I, came up with 10 suggestions, practical suggestions, born of our own experience, and the experience of thousands, sometimes millions of couples. And so that's what these top 10 tips are.
And there's summarized briefly in a trifold that we hope you picked up on your way in. If you didn't get one of those trifolds, just raise your hand and we'll have somebody bring one around to you. But we'd like you to each have one of these. And we're going to spend tonight just a few minutes fleshing out each one of these with illustrations and stories from our life. So it's our hope that you'll actually try these out yourselves and make them real in your life. See, whether you're married, preparing to marry, or celibate, these are basic life skills for living the theology of the body. And the theology of the body is certainly for every one of us.
I like to tease some of our colleagues that teach the theology of the body that Scripture tells us that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. Not the Word was made interesting and supposed to stay up here, So we're going to focus, most of the little bit of time that we have with you on those tips, okay? But we would also be remiss if we didn't put the sacrament of matrimony in the context, in a larger vision, in terms of what a couple in love really means for the well-being of the church, okay? And why it's so significant in the church. And really is a resource for evangelization in this current culture. So we'll hit that at the end of our little talk, okay?
We've planned to talk tonight for maybe about an hour, but we'd also like to open the floor for questions and answers. And so at the end of our presentation, maybe we'll take a brief restroom break, but then kind of open up the floor. There are actually some cards that are in the pews, or you may have seen or picked up on your way in, that ask for your questions so that we can respond to your questions.
Or you could just jot down, what do you think is the best thing about being married and the worst thing about being married? Now, we don't expect, if you're here with your spouse, for you to answer that second one out loud, unless you want to be sleeping on the couch. but you can pass it in and we'll speak to it, okay?
So let's get started with the top 10 tips for living in love.
So the first tip is to approach marriage as a vocation, not a situation. So what's a vocation? It's a call to a life's work. When I met Ronnie, I thought I was going to be a missionary nun. You see how God has a sense of humor? I had made a retreat when I was about 12 years old that convinced me that I had a vocation. And I thought there was only one kind, right? So even though I dated a lot of guys, I always broke it off before they got too serious. Look at this man. He was born serious, right? So, I broke it off with Ron, but the problem was that I didn't feel any peace. Now, I knew that when you are at the center of the Father's will, you feel peace. And so this really confused me. I thought I was doing what he wanted, and I was miserable. And so I really got on my face before God. I prayed like I had never prayed before in my life. And when the answer came, it was clear right down to my toes. Do you ever have something that you just know? I knew that God was sending me to Ron to effect his purposes in Ronnie. And that sense of being sent was so energizing. To this day, it's what energizes me. The word, from that moment on, I think I became a woman with a mission, right? And that word mission comes from missio, to be sent. The church teaches us that as spouses, we are the instrument of each other's salvation, right? So what's the good news of salvation? You're loved and you're lovable. So what that meant to me is that my job is to convince Ronnie that he's loved and lovable. I think that's the job description for marriage. You convince that man he's loved and lovable, right? And use all your talents, use your creativity, make it your life's work.
Now, mission is something that I think resonates particularly with men. Give a man a mission and you give him a sense of purpose and a sense of direction. I know that for myself as a man, I'm at my best when I have a clear-cut objective to accomplish. Just tell me what the job is and I'll get it done. I'll use whatever tools or resources are at my disposal. I'll clear away any obstacles. I'll solve any problem. I take it seriously and I throw myself into it in a very proactive way because I want to succeed. It's just that for most of us, we never think about marriage that way. Okay? We just let it happen. and we hope it works out. So having a mission kind of mentality requires a whole different mindset. It puts marriage into a new category of things that deserve my attention and my best effort. I just can't slack off and expect good results. Nothing in life happens that way. So when I use the word vocation to describe my marriage, and when I approach marriage with a mission kind of mindset, it elevates the importance of my marriage in my own mind. When my mission comes from the church, it's not only is the mission important to the church, but I'm important to the church. This kind of lifts us out and lifts me and our marriage out of the ordinary and compels us to think of ourselves and our behavior in a different light, a light that lends sanctity and value to everything that we do. So I'm less likely to see our marriage as just between us, and more likely to see how our married love plays an important role in the life of the church. Ultimately, it's up to me to choose to live my marriage as a vocation, as my life's work, with all that entails. I see it as my mission to love Kathy and to bring her joy. I didn't always see it that way. I didn't always think of marriage that way. I loved Kathy and I wanted her to be happy, but it just didn't translate into consistent, everyday, concrete, intentional action until I embraced this concept of living my marriage as a vocation. Now it colors everything I say and do, so that I say things differently. And I do a whole lot more for my marriage because I take my vocation seriously. And I measure my words and actions against their ability to advance my mission. And I really do think of it as my mission. And what I love about it is that my mission is unilateral. That makes everything simple for me. See, I don't have to do Kathy's job. She's got her own job. I just have to do my job. I don't have to figure out the whole marriage thing, which can be kind of confusing, especially for us guys. I just have to stay focused on my job to convince Kathy that she's loved and lovable, and just do or say whatever will convince her of that reality.
So one of the most powerful ways to do that is tip number 2, okay? Affirm each other every day as a man or as a woman. That whole church jargon about being the instrument of each other's salvation, too often that was mistaken and used as an excuse to criticize each other. We're going to shape each other up and get each other to heaven by telling each other what's wrong, with the other. Criticism is a cancer that kills all marriages, and it's not even helpful or powerful. Affirmation is so much more powerful in bringing out our goodness. When you tell me how good I am, I want to be that for you every time, okay? And compliments of any kind are really life-giving. But instead of settling for just complimenting each other on our competencies, great job, you did that well, it's much more powerful to affirm the other's attractiveness and lovableness as a man or as a woman, to affirm each other's masculinity or femininity, because that brings out more generosity, but it also nurtures a very potent atmosphere of being in love. And that atmosphere of being in love makes everything easier and everything fun.
So I've made it as my personal mission to convince Kathy that she is not only loved and lovable, but the most sexually attractive woman on the planet. Because that's who she is to me. It doesn't matter who she is to somebody else. She needs to know that that's who she is to me. And when I tell her how gorgeous she looks or how beautiful her smile is, she just lights up. I think it's my job to help her see herself through my eyes, which are the eyes of love. Because that's not only the way that she sees her, it's the way God sees her. So this is not just something that's nice to do. It's absolutely essential. See, Kathy doesn't always see herself the same way that I see her. Sometimes she's self-conscious when she doesn't like her appearance. So that's when I jump on my white horse and charge into action. I go out of my way to convince her that she is my heart's delight, and I'm crazy about her.
He's taken this a little bit too far, I'll have to tell you. I got tired of blow drying my hair. It's a pain. So I went and bought these big, gigantic rollers, thinking it was going to save me some time and smooth out the do, right? And I look ridiculous in them. I look like somebody from outer space. Well, Ron has decided that I am irresistible.
She is.
in
She's
the role.
absolutely irresistible. I can't control myself.
And he goes wild every time I put them on, right? It's gotten so that I can't put them on because he chases me around the house.
The
right?
rollers, Kath, the rollers.
But we really have learned that it pays off not to be stingy with affirmations. So we're lavish with it. I mean, every single morning when Ronnie gets out of the shower, I do this whole routine where, I kind of, oh my God, you're so handsome, and I throw myself at his feet. And right.
Well, what else? Of course, what else would you do?
But I also make a point of affirming his masculine virtue. And that's the part that he can't always see for himself. His honesty and his courage and his sincerity, his pureness of heart. That's what I fell in love with in him. Like most men, Ronnie's really uncomplicated. I think that's what we all love. Do you know that the word virile comes from virtus, which means virtue? That's typically what a woman falls in love with about her man. It's his strength, his courage, his constancy, right? So many wonderful virtues that are chivalrous and are strong. His willingness, to take the hit, do the lousy job, right? That's your virility, and that's what we really love. But that's what I see when I look at him, and he can't see that. I have to show him that.
Recently, our Holy Father, Pope Francis, spoke about affirmation to a group of couples. And this is what he said. He said that marriage is all about a man and a woman walking together, wherein the husband helps his wife to become ever more a woman, and wherein the woman has the task of helping her husband to become ever more a man. That is the task that you both share. Now, way back when we were only 5 years married, a wonderful priest suggested that we say something nice about each other every day. Just tell each other what we find attractive or endearing, what we appreciate about the other. Well, that sounded like a good idea. Certainly it sounded like a good idea. But ideas don't do anything unless you put them into action. And we actually just decided to try it. We did it, okay? We thought about what we would say, and we actually wrote it down and while we were apart, and then when we came back together again in the evening, we would share what we had written. That simple daily practice literally changed us. It had a profound effect on us. We began looking for the good, and we found it.
See, if you look for the good, you'll find it. If you look for the bad, you'll find it too. Don't go looking for the bad. That's not your job. Your job is to show them the good.
So much so that anything critical seemed out of character. It lost its voice. And affirmation became the way we were with one another.
Here's another little practical side tip to affirmation and rooting out all critical thought and critical attitude. I call it flirt before you speak. Okay, before you say anything, flirt a little bit. Whatever flirting is for you, because that's unique for every couple. But for me, I'm going to tickle Ronnie and look in his eyes, right? But if I flirt first, whatever comes out my mouth comes out nicer, right? Because it's in that atmosphere. I remember to be in love.
So this kind of leads us into tip number 3 of the top tips, which is love smarter, not harder. See, this evokes the concept of smart loving, as opposed to dumb loving, which I come by naturally, and which most of us tend to do a lot of. See, basically, smart loving is loving the way the other most wants to be loved. rather than the way we've been programmed to show love or how we feel most comfortable expressing love. It's giving the gift that would make the other happy rather than the gift that we ourselves would like to have. And yet so often we do just the opposite. Like at Christmas, we think it's a great gift because we would be thrilled to have it. Okay? But we can miss the mark. Even if we're willing to give what the other one most longs for or needs, do we even know what that is? Okay? See, most husbands and wives really want to make their spouse happy. They just have trouble figuring out what that is. Typically, men have trouble putting it into words, while women think they've already made it clear and they're frustrated because he doesn't get it. And this is particularly true about things that actually make us feel in love. Many of you know that one of the central concepts of St. John Paul II's theology of the body is the nuptial or spousal meaning of the body. And it simply boils down to the fact that we give ourselves as a gift to the other in marriage. See, on our wedding day, we make ourselves a total gift of self to the other. Well, that sounds lovely, okay? But how do we make that real? It's what John Paul II calls the content and behavior of our lives. So one of the things that Kathy and I have done or thought to do is we created a gift registry. Okay? It's a gift registry for couples. So it's clearly not the kind of registry that you set up at Macy's. Okay? Instead, it's a list of the kinds of gestures and behaviors that create that atmosphere of being in love. And since what works for each couple or individual is unique to them, we each fill out our own registry. So as a wife, you check off what it is that makes you feel in love, and those become marching orders for your husband. Concrete things that he can do with intentionality. Husbands get to check off the kinds of things that make them feel in love, and those become the wife's marching orders. See, this isn't rocket science. It works. It works because the essence of true love is other-centered generosity. Doing what will make the other one feel loved. Generously. Focusing on them rather than on ourselves. Now, even though you don't know us personally, I bet that if you had been with us for 5 minutes, you could guess what Kathy's number one love gesture is on her gift registry. You only have to be with us for maybe 5 minutes to realize that it's eye contact. Kathy loves when I look into her eyes. And that's why I do it. That's why I do it so much. It doesn't come naturally for me, but it's something that I can intentionally choose to do because I know that it makes her feel in love.
Now, you'll never know what is number one on Ron's list unless I told you, because it happens to be show up naked. Now, we're laughing, okay? But this isn't just fun. It really isn't, okay? What would you answer if I asked you what is the defining characteristic of marriage? Anybody got an answer? I think most couples would say love, right? But you love a lot of people. That's not the defining characteristic, okay? You're in love with only one person. That's what's unique about marriage. That's what makes it exclusive, right? And it isn't just romantic love. I'm talking about conjugal love, committed, belonging love between a husband and a wife. It's very, very special kind of love.
And so it's incredibly important to get in touch with, to be aware of what makes your spouse feel in love. Because if you do that, there'll be more love in your life. Okay? And for those of you who are married, we actually have a copy of one of those gift registries that we've developed. Conjugal love gestures for the very married. Okay?
Yeah, the engaged couples get a very different list, okay?
Okay. And we have these on the table as you came in, so you may have picked up one then, or if you haven't, on your way out, you can pick one up, okay? And just fill them out for each other and have fun.
Okay, so at this point, we're not going to go through the tips in the same order that they're in your trifold, only because several of them have to do with communication. And so we'd like to kind of put them all together under that umbrella. Everybody knows that communication is the lifeblood of any relationship, right? But all too often, I think we lump it all together. We're going to talk about it without ever really thinking about what is the purpose of this particular conversation. And so we found it really helpful to approach verbal communication kind of like a bag full of golf clubs. You know how you don't use the same club for every shot, right? It really depends on what you need it for. So if you're trying to transfer information in a way that avoids misunderstanding, there's strategies for that, okay? If you're trying to discern a course of action and make a couple decision about something, there's a foolproof process for that that can absolutely prevent ever having an argument. I promise you, all right? But in a really healthy love relationship, if we want to live in love, the large majority, the bulk of our verbal communication between us should be aimed at growing closer, at deepening the intimacy between us, at getting that emotional connection that makes us feel close, okay? And that's a very specific kind of communication. In relationship, if we're not growing closer, we're growing apart. And unless we're really asleep at the switch, most of us are kind of doing this and trying to head in, but we have these little jags in the road.
And to have the kind of connections that help us to grow closer as husband and wife, we need to develop a kind of communication, or remember the kind of communication that's captured in tip number 7 of the top 10 tips, which is relate. Relate rather than debate. Okay? The absolute best way that we know to grow closer as a couple and to achieve that powerful emotional connection is to learn to describe what it feels like to be you in a given situation and to share that with your spouse. See, we're not talking about discussing our opinions or thoughts, which can be correct or incorrect, which we could disagree about, but rather focusing for a moment only on our feelings, which are neither right nor wrong. They can't be judged. They have no morality because we didn't choose them. They are the weather inside of us. And just like the weather, all we can do is describe it. Okay? But for a couple who is in love, describing that and getting in touch with what your spouse is feeling leads to an incredible emotional connection, a sense of unity and oneness. Okay? It leads us to be able to offer and to experience unconditional acceptance. And it helps us to taste what it's like to be the other person, to get inside his or her skin, to realize also that our spouse knows what it's like to be us. The essence of intimacy is knowing and being known. And as husbands and wives, we know each other, and we're known by the other in a way that no one else knows us. Even if you just take that word intimacy, into me see. See into me. Okay? We all have a full set of feelings. Even Jesus experienced all of our human emotions. That's what is so wonderful about the incarnation. Chances are, whatever emotion your husband or wife is experiencing, you have also felt in some similar way at some time in your life. So you, as husband and wife, have a common basis of experience that you can tap into that crosses gender lines and allows you to relate to each other at a very deep personal level. Early in our marriage, Kathy and I learned a simple skill and a practice for describing our feelings. We used writing, we used similes, we used vivid word pictures. It was a verbal communication practice that for connecting intimately that was taught to us on Marriage Encounter, and is a skill that we also teach in Living in Love Every Day and to engaged couples in preparing to live in love. That skill became for us the driver in our bag of golf clubs. It not only helps us to stay alive and new to each other every day, but it breaks down barriers and enables us to achieve an emotional connection even when there's distance and disagreement. And the more we use this particular skill, the more it colors all of our verbal interactions with acceptance, empathy, and a desire to relate rather than debate that leads to feeling close no matter what the circumstance or the situation that we may be in.
So here's an example from our life, okay? A little bit of tension or distance can arise between the two of us when Ronnie's blood sugar drops low. Ron is an insulin-dependent diabetic, and he wears a pump and a sensor, and he works very hard to keep very good control of his diabetes, but inevitably there will be occasions when his blood sugar drops dramatically. And that is a dangerous situation because it affects your brain, and you can slip into a coma. So I am of the opinion that we need to act swiftly at those times and that he needs my assistance, right? However, Ron is of the opinion that he could do everything himself and he would like to do it at his own pace. Now, no amount of discussion about our judgments and opinions and facts bearing on the matter would ever make us feel close in that situation, okay? But we sat down and we wrote letters to each other about how we feel, how each of us feel in that moment when his blood sugar has dropped down to 50, okay? And I described a very threatened feeling. You know, it felt like, you know, when you see the flashing red light of the cop car in your rear view mirror, you know, that threatened
Panic.
feeling? Okay. Tense. It was kind of like when our 20-something kids are out late at night at the bar with the car, and I'm going from window to window, you know, pacing, right, before cell phones, right? It was tense and alert, you know, and a little bit panicky, right? Now, instead of arguing with my feeling or telling me that I shouldn't feel that way, Ron can choose to think about, has he ever felt threatened like that? And that's what he did. And he called to mind a time when he rushed our daughter Devon to the hospital, and he was pacing outside of the ICU. And he felt so powerless and so tense and so threatened. And in that moment, we had a connection, right? And then he described how he feels when his blood sugar is low. You know, and he described how he feels so confused, and then he feels very disrespected because everybody starts barking orders. All my daughters. He has 7 daughters. Yeah.
Blessed am I among women.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And so they're all, you know, barking orders at him, and he feels ganged up on. And he described it like he feels like, you know, being backed into a corner by a pack of wolves, right? So I started to think about, when have I felt ganged up on like that? Well, I remembered a time recently at a family gathering when I voiced a very unpopular opinion, and all of my daughters descended on me to tell me how I was wrong and started at me, and I felt so ganged up on and also so disrespected. See, and in that moment I felt so close to Ronnie. And so from then on, anytime his blood sugar is low, we actually feel close, and we're very aware of what the other is going through. Okay? So
and
this is a skill.
because I'm more aware of what Kathy's feeling, it also influences me. And I realize that I can change my behavior. I can be more open to her influence because I know what's going on inside of her.
Guys, no one is born with this skill, but anybody can learn it. This is a learned skill. Our mentors teach it to couples in 2 hours flat, and it's a terrific connector, okay?
So now obviously verbal communication is important, but it's not the only kind of communication. There's also nonverbal communication. We say so much more with facial expressions and body language than we say just with words. Most men tend to appreciate nonverbal gestures because they tend to be less adept at articulating feelings verbally.
They have less speech centers. Women have speech centers on both sides of their brain. Anybody surprised?
Yeah. So take a minute right now to kind of get back in touch with the feelings that come and the emotions that are associated with a specific event in your own life. Think about your first kiss.
It's a nonverbal communication, right?
Okay. We
Do you remember
remember it. Every one of us remembers that first kiss. And why do we remember it? Because it communicated something. It was a statement. It was a message, a very special message. It said, we're not just friends anymore. You and I are special. We've taken this relationship to a different level, okay? It's like that, we saw once on TV a commercial where the guy comes along and he sweeps the girl off her feet and kisses her passionately. And at the bottom of the screen, there's this message. It says, the original instant message, okay? And if you stop to think about it for a minute, every physical action communicates a message. The problem is that we tend not to verbalize those messages. So the actions can be less meaningful. They can lose their meaning. They can even be misunderstood.
So let's take a look at tip number 4, which says, approach making love as something you're saying, not something you're doing to each other. It was 1975, ladies and gentlemen, when Father Chuck Gallagher first challenged us and all the couples that were working with him with this idea that making love was a form of communication and not just an activity or a performance, okay? Now, this was before the now famous audiences that we refer to as the theology of the body that St. John Paul II preached, okay, in which he coined the phrase, the language of the body, when he was talking about making love. Now, we already knew at this point that the attitude that was very prevalent in the culture, that making love, sex, was just an activity, was something you do, was primarily the cause for most of the disillusionment in marriage. And that it caused loneliness. You know why? Okay, if it's something you're doing, you can do it more or less well. Okay, and then you get a performance attitude. And that is self-conscious rather than other-conscious. And then you fall into traps of comparing performances, okay? And guys especially start counting how many times they did it, you know, and they think that the marriage is in great shape if the number is high, or that, you know, they're failing if the number is low, without any awareness of what their wife is experiencing, okay? And it leads to a lot of loneliness and sometimes feelings of guilt on the part of the man and disillusionment. So we knew that, you know, that attitude that's in the culture was responsible for a lot of problems. So this idea that, you know, it could be approached as communication was really intriguing for us, right? And we really wanted to make kind of a paradigm shift in the way that we thought about it, but we didn't know how to make it real. Well, that night, we got home and crawled into bed, and I looked into Ronnie's eyes, and I said, what do you want to say to me tonight? And from that moment on, we were in a very intimate conversation using our whole bodies. It really changed everything.
This was really challenging for me, okay, as you might expect. See, I don't like to talk, even with my clothes on. But at that moment, I asked myself, okay, why? Why do I want to make love with Kathy? And the words that came to mind echoed our wedding vows. I wanted to say, I'm so grateful for you, for the gift that you are to me. I want to give you my whole self. I want to be close to you. I want to make you as happy as I possibly can. I am yours, you are mine. And this experience of speaking what I was trying to communicate to Kathy by making love with her literally stopped me in my tracks. I found myself paying attention to her in a way that was new for us and not so focused on what I was doing. Now when we make love, I find it so engaging to speak from my heart to her heart. And hear what Kathy is saying to me reassures and encourages me and literally convinces me that we are making love together and I'm not just doing something to her.
This was a game changer for me, okay? And it continues to be the source of unbridled joy in my life. When I'm in an intimate conversation with Ronnie, I am riveted on him and trying to get the message through to him. I'm not self-conscious at all. Okay, I'm just interested in him getting the message. And it draws me out of myself. And that's what ecstasy is all about, isn't it? You're outside of yourself. Now, the messages that we have to say, those messages that intercourse was intended to communicate, I love you totally and permanently. That's why we use the genitals, you know that, because they link generations past with generations future. It's the only part of the body that communicates permanence. It says, I love you and your children and your children's children for all generations. So it's a powerful thing, right? That message is always true. But on any given night, it's new because it's a little conversation going on. We're looking into each other's eyes, right? So one night I might want to just say, I miss you, or you make me feel beautiful, or, I'm so happy to be your wife, or I feel safe in your arms. It's happening right there. So there's this excited sense to it. Now when Ronnie makes a gesture to make love, I'm always eager because I know I'm going to hear these affirming messages, and he's going to tell me all these wonderful things. And let's face it, I am never too tired for an intimate conversation.
This is really a major concept that we normally spend a lot of time kind of cracking open and helping couples to understand and try on for themselves. But for us tonight, just as a little practical tip, on your way home tonight, spend a little time just thinking about what you would want to say to your wife or to your husband. And then when you crawl into bed, look into each other's eyes and speak those messages.
Suppose you only had tonight, right? What if one of you were to die tonight? What would you want to make sure she heard you say? Don't leave that unsaid. Now, some of you are out there saying, look, we've been making love one way for 50 years, Can we really change, right? Are they for real up there? So I'm going to tell you just a little story to give you a little hope and inspiration. It is an absolute true story, okay? About a year and a half ago, we were giving a Living in Love retreat workshop in rural Kansas. The bishop had gotten behind the whole Living in Love suite, and he wanted it all over the diocese. So we went to all the parts of the diocese, and this was a farming community. And it was a very large weekend, about 50 couples on it. And on the Living in Love retreat, there is a presentation and exercise about the attitudes in the culture that we tend to breathe in without realizing it. Not the obnoxious things that are out there, but the ordinary conventional wisdom of the day that sounds reasonable and we all sort of go along with without questioning it, right? But they tend to lead us to lower the priority of being in love. And we do bring up this attitude, that sex is an activity on there. And we talk about this paradigm shift. And we do share how we've just, begun to speak while making love and how meaningful that is, right? So we're given the talk, right? And we're giving that part of the talk. And there is an ancient couple sitting down to our left. He was in his early 80s. They were both white-haired, okay? And they're giggling through this talk, okay? So at the break, she comes over to me because she feels obliged to explain her bad behavior, right? And she says, in her Midwestern twang, I apologize for laughing during your talk. But I said to him, I can't speak to you when we make love. You're so hard of hearing. You're just going to say, what? What? You're going to spoil the whole mood. Well, without missing a beat, I said to her, well, your hearing is fine. He could speak to you. And she says, now there's an idea. And she pulls me over to this older gentleman. And she says, now you tell him. So now I'm looking up at this gentleman. I'm saying, you could speak to her while you make love because, like, her hearing is fine. I'm dying. I am dying of embarrassment, right? But that evening before the romantic dinner, he called me aside and he said, Kathy, I want you to know I'm going to wear my hearing aid to bed. I don't want to miss anything. And the postscript to this that was so wonderful was that on Sunday of Living in Love, they left looking 20 years younger. They really did. And as he was leaving, he was almost out the door. There was about 80 people between him and me, and he shouted over the crowd, by the way, Kathy, I lost both my hearing aids in bed last night, but it was worth it. It's a true story. You can't make this stuff up.
A few years ago, we were at a secular smart marriages conference, and there were about 1,500 marriage therapists and researchers, marriage educators and authors. And at the evening banquet, they excitedly announced the latest findings from a multivariate study from Creighton University that identified the top 3 indicators of success in marriage. Everyone expected to hear communication, communication, communication. But there was kind of a collective gasp when instead they named few religious differences, shared religious practices, and approval of the family. And as we all know, approval of the family is often associated with our religious identity. We were not so surprised, however, because there had been other studies with surprisingly similar results. The earliest one we ever came across was from the Lynn brothers, who quoted the 1980 federal census as having reported that couples who attended church regularly and prayed together as a family had a divorce rate of only 1 in 1,105, compared to 1 out of every 3 in the culture at that time. It actually makes common sense. Since God is love, when we invite Him into our marriage, we invite more love into our marriage. Prayer introduces a sense of accountability to Him for how we live out our call to the vocation of marriage, and it turns our hearts towards love. We all know how powerful physical and emotional nakedness can be, but spiritual nakedness with each other is the deepest kind of intimacy. It involves the same kind of openness and vulnerability that we have in our relationship with God. We can't hide anything from God. Okay? So tip number 5, be spiritually naked in prayer, is arguably one of the most powerful practices that we could adopt as a couple. Maybe that's why the devil seems to use all kinds of fears to keep couples away from sharing prayer, faith experiences, and our personal relationship with God, with each other. Honestly, this was true for Kathy and I when we first got married. We did not pray together. We said grace at meals. We went to Mass together. We did all of the normal Catholic things. But none of those required any personal vulnerability. In fact, at that time in my life, I'm not sure I really prayed alone or even knew how to pray other than to recite rote prayers like other cultural Catholics. On the other hand, I thought Kathy was like the most Catholic person that I knew. She was more Catholic than the Pope. She went to Mass every day, and faith was central for her. So the idea of sharing my personal relationship with Jesus with Kathy was a non-starter because I didn't think I had anything to share.
I didn't share either, okay? And that was because my faith is very simple. Ronnie's a really brilliant guy. He's got 2 advanced degrees from MIT. You know, he studied nuclear engineering and nuclear physics and all. And I thought he would laugh at my simple faith, so I didn't talk about it either. But what broke the ice is we had learned a safe way, right, to get into any topic. We told you, we learned how to share what we were feeling, and feelings were neither right nor wrong. So that was a great way to start. We could share what we were feeling at Mass or what we were feeling at some religious event, okay? And then we tried writing down what we would say to God if we were alone and just talking to him, and then letting the other read it, okay? And that kind of broke the ice, right? And each milestone, of course, it was a long journey, and there are a lot of steps, and the journey's not over, right? But each step in the journey brought this thrilling excitement of feeling close. It is a thrill. It is the desire of every woman of faith's heart to share faith with her man, with her husband. And for me, it was, the greatest gift that Ronnie ever gave me. And I felt it's so trusted. And so at each step, the Lord kept encouraging us to bear our souls more and more to one another.
Making the paradigm shift in lovemaking from something we were doing to something that we were saying actually helped us to invite God into the bedroom. First of all, we had already broken the ice and were verbalizing the messages that we wanted to say to each other.
You know what? Those messages of I'm yours and you're mine, I want to belong to you, all of those messages, those are God's messages to us. And we realized that. And we realized he was present in that love.
Speaking those messages made lovemaking more meaning-filled. And I found myself thanking God for the gift of Kathy. It was spontaneous and it was effusive, and I realized that I was praying. I was praying from my heart. And over time, all this made it easier for me to talk about God with Kathy and share the secrets of my relationship with him, with her.
As powerful as prayer is, it actually is not the whole story in terms of why religion is so favorably correlated with success in marriage, okay? There really are 2 more important reasons. First, okay, is really simple. If you are adrift in this culture, you are bombarded constantly with values for privacy, independence, consumerism, frantic activity, right? If your goal is a deep, close, intimate, belonging relationship, those are decidedly unhelpful. They are not going to advance that goal, right? But if you go to church even occasionally, you are going to hear values for compassion, forgiveness, belonging, self-sacrifice. Very helpful in creating a close, intimate relationship. But secondly, there's actually a whole different paradigm for marriage. What the church holds out for marriage is very different. It's a different animal than secular marriage.
Secular marriage is typically lived out as a very private, consensual relationship where the focus is on experiencing personal happiness and getting our needs met, okay? On the other hand, Christian marriage, and specifically the sacrament of matrimony in the Catholic Church, has a very specific mission with respect to the community of the faithful. On our wedding day, you, the church, asked Kathy and I to love each other in the same way as Christ loves the church, so that you could not only understand what that love is like, but that we could literally manifest that love in and for your benefit. This is a real presence of Jesus in the intrinsically sexual, self-sacrificing, and committed love of husbands and wives for each other. The church did not make marriage a sacrament to elevate it or so that we would take it more seriously. It always was a sacrament. St. John Paul II calls marriage the primordial sacrament, which means it always was from the very beginning.
It's a sign that everyone can see. We had an experience some years back that was really brought this home to us, okay? We were asked to give a talk up at Penn State. It's a huge university, on the East Coast. And they asked us to explain the difference between secular marriage and the sacrament of matrimony. Now, we were in an academic setting, so you know how you start talking about paradigms and you use that kind of language, right? But I realized our background is in adult learning, okay? And adults hear everything against the backdrop of their own experience. If what I'm saying to you doesn't resonate with your experience, you don't even hear me, right? And so in the middle of the talk, I realized we had to tap into the experience of these kids, right? And we were already standing up talking. And I come up with this harebrained idea. And God bless Ronnie, he's an engineer. He makes it happen.
Oh boy, here we go again.
Right. So I whispered to him, we've got to tap into these kids' experience. And I came up with this idea. There were 2 chalkboards in the room, and they were on wheels. And so I told Ronnie, take half of this group and go to the next conference room and brainstorm with them. And I had the other half of the group. And I asked my half of the group to describe for me what the love between a bride and a groom, a deeply in love husband and wife, was like. Describe conjugal love to me, okay? Give me some adjectives, some characteristics. And we put it up on the blackboard, okay?
And I had my group, and we did the same sort of thing, except we looked at adjectives that described Christ's love for the church. How does Christ love us, Permanently, he forgives us, he sacrificed. We wrote down all of these adjectives.
Well, I had no idea if this would work, but we rolled the 2 blackboards together, and we really got goosebumps because one was a mirror image of the other. One was a sign of the other. They used the same words almost in the same sequence. I remember because they said passionate, intimate, forgiving, and forever. And what was really interesting was the more sexual the language, like passionate and intimate, the more closely it described Christ's love for the church. And it is that kind of conjugal love that is the clearest revelation. And it's not just a symbol. He's really present in that love. It manifests that love.
When you think about the way Christ loves us, it challenges us to love the same way.
He gives his body to us on the cross and in the Eucharist. It's not a coincidence that we give our bodies to one another as a sign of that giving. We have a marriage bed crucifix on the far wall in our bedroom because I like to look at it and hear those words, "This is my body given for you," when I crawl into bed, because that's what it's about. That's why John Paul says that we're a permanent reminder to the church of what happened on the cross, because it's a gift of ourself, right?
We can't just settle for getting along. Jesus doesn't just get along with us. He's passionately in love with us.
So it's only in the context of that tip, to be a sign, be a living sign, that some of the other tips make a lot of sense. Okay, tips 6, 8, and 9, okay, start to make sense when you think about this call to reveal Christ's love for the church. Like number 8, which is never go to sleep angry.
This is actually scriptural. Ephesians 4:26. And when we connect that with the call to Ephesians, which is as Christ loves the church, love as Christ loves the church, it becomes a powerful reminder of what God is asking of us. Jesus is always ready to forgive. He forgives us immediately. We expect it of him. We're counting on it. So that's where we ought to put the bar for our own forgiveness as husbands and wives. It's also incredibly practical. Studies show that our brains never sleep. In fact, the last thought on our mind before we drift off to sleep usually repeats itself over and over all night long. So if we go to sleep angry, we're probably going to wake up angrier, okay? And it will be much more difficult to reconcile.
Actually, I use this insight in reverse in a practical, positive way. Ever since we did the exercises of St. Ignatius, I've had a practice of a daily examine, okay? And basically, just before I go to sleep at night, I kind of examine my conscience. And I really ask the Lord, how did I do as a wife today? You know, like on a scale of 1 to 10, right? And I kind of look at my day, and, you know, sometimes I did something that really knocked it out of the park, you know, and that encourages me. And other times I really missed an opportunity to love, you know. And so that helps me to make plans for the next day. And then the last thing I do before I drift off to sleep, and Father Chuck suggested this to me, was to think about everything I love about Ronnie. So I call to mind the things, my favorite things about him. You know, his sincerity. I think about his big brown eyes. I think about, you know, his honesty or his chivalry. And I drift off to sleep with that. And those thoughts repeat like a prayer. I get credit for 8 hours of prayer that way, right? Because your brain doesn't sleep. Right? But I wake up grateful. I wake up with a grateful heart, you know, and with enthusiasm for loving him.
Okay, here's a news flash. None of us behave well when we are hurt. So it doesn't make any sense to leave it until then, when we're not good with one another, when we're flooded with strong emotions, when we may not be thinking clearly, to figure out what we're going to do to deal with the situation. Okay? It's so much smarter to decide in advance, when you're at your best, what you will do the next time you hurt each other, when the tension or distance just comes between you. See, one of the reasons that we stew on things or go to bed angry is that we've lost sight of the other's goodness, and we quite honestly don't know what to do. So Kathy and I personally use a structured process that we've found foolproof. And it starts with just a catchphrase that signals that there's been a break in our relationship. And at least one of us. Now, sometimes we both are aware that something happened, but more often than not, Kathy suggests that we need to address something, and I'm clueless, okay? I didn't realize this at all. So just her alerting me to the fact that we need to address something is helpful to me. And what it does is stop things right where they are. We don't inflict more hurt. We simply separate and reflect individually so that we can regain perspective and enter into a helpful reconciliation process. We describe what we felt like at the time of that break in our relationship, what was going on. And we stick strictly to the emotions. We refrain. We discipline ourselves not to bring in accusations or blame or thoughts or judgments or opinions about who was right or wrong. Then, having written, we come together and share what we've written. We pray for compassion and we listen to what the other was feeling. That in itself kind of melts our hearts and helps us to sincerely ask for forgiveness and then grant it convincingly. But we can go one step further. We can actually ask God to lift the hurt that we caused from the other's heart. Obviously, this is a far cry from just saying, "I'm sorry." Or worse yet, just waiting until it blows over. But we found that if we prioritize being in love by reconciling well, we actually grow closer through that hurt and that experience of reconciliation. In fact, the reality of restoring our relationship is so powerful that we have an urgency to express our renewed commitment to relationship more powerfully and concretely. And the most natural expression of that for us is making love. Well, maybe we can't make love right then and there, but we would want to. And just that urgency or that desire communicates that we really are back together again and have restored the oneness of our relationship.
Now, obviously, this takes prioritizing being in love, right? And that is countercultural. In today's culture here in the United States, we're told to put absolutely everything ahead of being in love in our marriage. Our job, being fit, and especially our children. We're just always tempted to do that. But it isn't It's for our children that we have to prioritize being in love. Because that's when they feel safest. Their whole world is right when we're in love, right? And if you want your kids to wait for marriage, you got to show them a marriage that's worth waiting for. So it's for their sake that we do this. We had a dear friend, he was a Capuchin friar, Father Joe. And have you ever had somebody that has a comical face? I mean, he just had these bushy eyebrows, and he was really expressive, and he spoke with a really strong Italian-American accent. But he loved to describe God's plan for the family like it was a machine, that had a certain design by the Creator, right? And he would say it like this. He would say, this is the way the machine, she's designed to work. You love him, he love you, you're going to make a love. And the love, she go out, and the children, they eat it up. Now, you can use the machine the way she no designed to work, but she's not going to work so good. And it's true. If we're going to put our attention straight on our kids, we're going to overload their wires. They are not built for adult relationship. But when we fill each other's tank and get our needs for intimacy met here and in our relationship with God, there is an overflow of benevolent love that's unconditional, that they eat up and they thrive on that. So it really is for their sake that we do it all.
Now, earlier in our talk tonight, we mentioned Father Chuck Gallagher, and Chuck was our personal mentor and spiritual father until his death in 2013. But he was also the founder of the center that we currently direct, and the co-author of Living in Love. He was the originator of Worldwide Marriage Encounter. He was a prophetic and brilliant Jesuit who transformed millions and millions of lives, including ours. And one of the most powerful things that Father Chuck would say to us, because it communicated an urgency to reconcile hurt anytime that anything came between us. He would often say, well, it may be your marriage, but it's our sacrament.
And you can't desecrate it.
Okay? So Jesus entrusts to us the sacramental life, and we just can't let him down. Our kids, our priests, our singles, our religious, everyone is counting on us to live the sacramental life that has been entrusted to us. And the Lord is willing to flood us with the grace to do that. All we have to do is ask and be open to it. When I'm struggling, I can pray for compassion for Kathy. I can pray for the grace to forgive her. And my good and gracious God never lets me down, because our love is a sacramental love that serves a greater purpose than our own happiness and well-being. You see, a sacrament is a sign, something visible that we can see that says God is really present here. It's usually something ordinary, but his presence makes it extraordinary. Bread and wine becomes the Eucharist. Water gives us life through baptism. So what is the sign of matrimony? Nothing less than the couple themselves, and specifically the permanent, passionate, life-giving love between a husband and wife that reminds us of how Christ loves us. Most of us realize that we are living in a culture that is toxic to marriage. But it's not the extreme abuses that are the biggest threat to us in living this sacramental life. Most of us resist those. But the devil tricks us when we fall victim to the seemingly innocuous attitudes in the culture that trivialize love and marriage. In spite of the fact that sex sells everything and falling in love is glamorized to the extreme, our culture tells us that being in love in marriage is not the serious agenda for life. It tells us that romance is just fun for special occasions, and that we lose our sexuality as we grow older. Okay? So we lower our expectations. We start focusing on career and work and raising children. We settle for being kind and living our marriage more like brothers and sisters than passionate lovers. And that robs the world of the visible presence of a passionate, loving God that marriage is intended and depended upon to reveal. So we start to believe the lie that being in love is a stage we grow out of, rather than a mature spirituality that we grow into. We had an incident in our lives some years ago that illustrated just how countercultural being in love really is. I happened to be straightening up in the front bedroom of our house when I looked out the window and noticed that my neighbor, who we didn't really know very well because we had just moved into that area, our neighbor was arguing with his teenage daughter in the front yard. And as I watched, the argument got heated. My neighbor got physical with her. He hit her with his fist and knocked her down. Without ever thinking, I found myself heading outside the front door. By the time I got next door, the father and daughter had already gone into the house, but I followed them in without even knocking. I met the father in the hall, and I simply said, "Is there anything I can do?" To which he replied angrily, "Just get her out of here." So I brought her home with me. I brought her home, and Kathy rocked this hysterical teenager in her arms. The teenager's name was also Kathy, and she came to live with us for several months.
And, at the time, we just loved up on her. At the time, we had the Todd Squad. We had about 5 or 6 little people, right? And when Kathy got on her feet and got a job, every night when she came home from work, I would line up the little guys, and they would applaud as she opened the door to come into the house, right? And they'd have welcome home signs, right? One night we were preparing dinner, and Kathy told me that she ran into an old friend who asked her where she was living. And I was really sensitive to the fact that she, was probably going to be embarrassed to tell her friend that she'd been kicked out of her home, right? And so I said, "Oh, honey, what did you tell him, about where you live?" And she said, "I told him I live in a fairy tale." Now, I know that she meant that as a compliment, but I was very upset by that comment, okay? It disturbed me no end because it meant that the enemy had won and convinced the world that love wasn't real, that true love wasn't possible, that you couldn't live in love, and that's a lie. Now, we've touched on all the tips, guys, but what I want to say is that, when Kathy said that, it bothered me so much, okay, because we are real. We bleed. We've seen tragedy. We have buried 2 daughters. We have been, we know we're real, and Christ is real. And that's the point. He can transfigure and he can transform our lives, and it doesn't mean we won't feel pain. But it does mean that joy is possible. And I know some of you guys are out there saying, "Are they for real?" And it is the enemy that wants to convince us that love isn't real. Now, we've touched on all these tips, but we wanted to take just a couple of minutes, okay, to put the couple in love in the context of a broader vision. Because honestly, I would suggest to you that a couple in love in the sacrament of matrimony is arguably the most attractive proclamation of the gospel to this current culture that we are living in. See, everyone is drawn to a couple in love.
And we certainly want the best for every couple and for every family. But there's more at stake here than just the well-being of the couple. As John Paul clearly states in the Theology of the Body, according to the author of Ephesians, the conjugal relationship which unites a husband and wife should help us to understand the love which unites Christ and the church. That reciprocal love between Christ and the church in which the divine eternal plan for the salvation of man is realized. So the analogy works in both directions. It helps us to understand the essence of marriage, but it also helps us to understand the essence of the relationship of Christ and the church.
See, God is passionately in love with us. He's head over heels in love with us. And the closest thing we have on earth to that is to see a husband and wife who are committed and crazy in love with each other and other-centered. And that's where that becomes real for us.
So if we look at the church for a moment through the prism of the sacrament of matrimony, the most compelling ethos of a couple who's passionately in love is their desire for unity, to literally become two in one flesh, as an efficacious expression of their spiritual, emotional, and physical unity. But it doesn't stop there. Their desire for unity finds its natural expression in the miraculous power that their love has to give life.
Okay, so what does that teach us as a church? When you look at a couple, they want to be close, they want to be one, and their love gives life. As a community, we're supposed to be one body. We're supposed to be close, right? And give life. That's converts. That's evangelization, right? That's spread the life of God. If we're not doing that, it's like a couple contracepting, right? It's we're just not giving life anywhere.
One of the awesome things about working with the sacrament is that through the prism of relationship, even the most controversial issues that we're dealing with in the church actually start to make sense, and we understand why we are the way we are and why we do what we do.
Yeah, look at anything through the prism of a couple and you'll understand it. Anything you're having trouble with about the Catholic faith will make sense to you. We had an incident that illustrated this not long ago. We were running a Living in Love Everyday course. It's kind of like a once-a-week date night follow-up from our retreat, right? And it was a group of about 10 couples, and we were meeting in home. And 2 of the couples were interfaith couples. And we had just done the 4th session, which is about the language of the body. And so we were talking about, love making as something you're saying and not doing. But we went a little further to apply those concepts to promoting chastity among the young. See, it's very helpful if you have teenagers or singles, okay? Because if it's something I'm saying, it's not more special if I said it to 50 other girls, right? If it means I love you permanently, if it's language, we can't misuse language because it loses its meaning. How can it mean I love you permanently after the wedding when it didn't mean I love you permanently before the wedding, right? So all those things are very, very useful, and we had already, discovered that. So now we were starting session 5, which was on the sacrament of matrimony. And we're just about to begin the evening, right? And so, I'm starting with prayer, and I'm just about to start this prayer. And the Catholic wife of the Lutheran husband, they're both attorneys, they taught law at Villanova Law, blurts out angrily, "I am so upset with my Catholic church because it will not give communion to my wonderful husband who is Lutheran." I mean, it was like, so I did what anybody would do. I went for humor, let's lighten this up in a hurry, right? And so I said, "Oh, Lane, you know how we Catholics are. We won't give our body without a permanent commitment." And everybody suddenly understood, oh, that makes sense. But then I went on to say, there's a principle in relationship that the level of intimacy has to be matched by the level of commitment, or else somebody gets hurt. Well, for us Catholics, communion is the most intimate thing we do. It's a full intimacy, and so it has to have a full commitment. And he understood completely. Apparently, he had started going up to communion, and some of the other parishioners had noticed it, and that's how this all came about, right? And he apologized because he realized that he was making kind of a false statement by doing that. The wonderful postscript to this is that 2 weeks after the course was done, he showed up at RCIA, right? And he bumped into the other husband who was Episcopal, and they both entered the church within a month. Yeah, couples who are intentionally trying to live in love,
possess an inherent ability to illuminate the teachings of our faith in concrete realities that we all can understand. And that makes us, as couples, as the sacrament of matrimony, avenues of evangelization in our homes and in our parishes and in the wider world.
See, look at everything through that sacrament, right? Some people don't understand why Catholics don't believe in divorce. Well, if you're a sign of Christ's love for the church, Jesus never stops loving us, right? Why are we open to life? Because Christ's love always gives life. You can't be a sign of Christ's love if you don't give life, right? All these controversial things suddenly make sense.
So as you might know, the word evangelization actually comes from the Greek and literally means announcing good news, okay? So a couple in love is good news at many levels. See, just falling in love is a conversion experience. For most of us, it was the first time that we actually got out of our selfish selves and cared more about another human being than we did about ourselves. It certainly is a conversion from being self-centered to being other-centered. And it opens the door to a generous, selfless way of loving. All of us are drawn to love, to couples in love. It's as if God so wanted us to know his love that he kind of stamped it in our being when he made us male and female and drew us to each other. And so when we talk about the gift of a sacramental couple, we're talking about recognizing that they're a hidden treasure in the church, and that by virtue of their lived experience of loving, they have a gift to share, and empowering them to become living sacraments in our midst, we empower them to be evangelizers who bring the good news of God's love to others. We have seen this so convincingly, and we believe it's really a part of the new evangelization that St. John Paul II dreamt of when he talked about old truths using new language and new methods. We see conversions of hearts and habits as couples come back to or into the church, and miracles of spiritual and emotional healing. We hear these stories all the time. One young man started our marriage preparation course as an anti-Catholic Southern Baptist and caused an incredible stir when he publicly announced at the wedding reception that he was going to become Catholic, and he wanted his mentor husband to be his sponsor. We even had an atheist raised in communist Hungary come into the church after living in love. Converts to the faith are great because they affirm our own faith and release enthusiasm in the parish.
So I think we'll make our summary statement here. Words that were given to us by a pastor from upstate New York. He had grown very cynical about marriage. And unfortunately, a lot of our priests are discouraged, okay? He literally told us that he would rather do funerals than weddings, right? And it was so sad, but he had a kind of an added disadvantage because it was a blue-collar community, and so there's actually, if you've seen Barbara Whitehead's data recently, there is actually a positive correlation between advanced education and lower incidence of divorce, and so he had that kind of working against him too. But his take on it was that all of the young people were living together. They were all disenfranchised with the church, and nobody cared about their faith, and nobody was interested in it. So he had gotten, pretty cynical. And he only reluctantly agreed to try preparing to live in love because his associate pastor was excited about it, right? So, as God would have it, the next couple that comes to the rectory to set a wedding date sees this Monsignor who's cynical, or this father, and they were one of the worst, right? Impetuous guy who, anything on his mind comes out his mouth. So the first thing he blurts out to Father is, "Father, I just want you to know we're only getting married in the Catholic Church to please my grandmother." Well, God bless this saintly and sage priest. He said, "Well, if you're going to get married in the Catholic Church, you ought to know what that's all about. So I'm going to pair you with a couple who is trying to live out the full vision of the church, and they're going to put you through a 7-week experiential course. And at the end of that, if you still want to get married in the Catholic Church, come and see me." And he figured he'd never see them again, right? So he was pretty surprised when 8 weeks later they showed up. And the kid was still as impetuous because he blurts out as he walks through the door, "Father, I want you to know we decided we're not going to sleep together again until our wedding night." Which definitely got Father's attention, right? And so he sits right down, and then she says, "I was wondering if there was any way that I could become a Catholic." And the clincher was that the young boy said to him, "I don't know if this is possible, Father, but is there any way I could go through RCIA with her? Because I realize now I don't know much about my faith, but it sure is making sense to me now." And so the next time we saw Father Pryor, he came running in the room to us, and he said, "Why didn't you tell me? This isn't marriage preparation. This is evangelization." And I just laughed at him. I said, "You know what, Father? Nowadays, that's the same thing."
We thought that we would just kind of wrap up with a few words from Mother Teresa of Calcutta. And you may be aware of the fact that when she was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace, a journalist interviewing her asked her what her answer was for achieving peace in our world. And without hesitation, she just answered, "Let the husband smile at the wife. Let the wife smile at the husband." And that's something that every one of us can do. And it would be a great place to start. But we can ambition for even more. In 1 John, the evangelist tells us that God is love. And he who lives in love lives in God, and God lives in him. We hope that our top 10 tips for living in love will help each of us to experience more of God's love every day in our lives.
Thank you very much.